Hey kids, Mrs. Rail here. We're going to review what clauses are, okay? A clause is a group of related words that contains a subject and a verb. So today we're going to talk about independent and dependent clauses. An independent clause. Okay, well, independent means that you can do things on your own or you don't need to depend on anyone else. Well, that's what an independent clause is. An independent clause can stand alone by itself. It is a complete sentence. An independent clause also has a subject and a verb, and it has a complete thought, so it will make sense to you. Now we're going to talk about dependent clauses. Okay, well, dependent means you have to rely on someone else. You can't be alone. You can't do things alone. If you look, there's a little baby or a little kid over there. He has to be with his mom, depend on his mom to take care of him. That's what dependent means. You're depending on someone else. So a dependent clause cannot stand alone. It can't be up by itself as a complete sentence. It must be attached to an independent clause. A dependent clause also has a subject, a verb, but it does not have a complete thought. So the difference between the two is the independent clause has a complete thought, and the dependent clause does not have a complete thought. They both have subjects and verbs. An independent clause makes sense all by itself, but a dependent clause does not. So now I'm going to give you some examples of independent clauses. Here is an example. We have this sentence, Superboy ate ice cream. So if we're looking at this sentence, the subject would be Superboy. So I'm going to mark that here. This would be the subject. Okay, and the verb in this sentence is ate, so I'm going to mark the verb there. That's a little better color. And then I'm going to chop here in between my subject and my predicate. So I have the Superboy is the subject, and my verb is ate. So notice that we do have a subject and a verb here. And Superboy ate ice cream makes sense, so that is an independent clause. It can stand by itself. Okay, my next sentence I have here is the ice cream melted. This isn't an independent clause. My subject in this sentence, I'm going to mark my subject, is ice cream. Okay. And my verb in this sentence is melted. So I have my subject and my verb again. And this sentence makes sense by itself. The ice cream melted makes sense by itself, so that makes it an independent clause. It has its subject, it has the verb, and it also makes sense by itself. That's why it's an independent clause. So now we're going to talk about dependent markers. And what those are they're going to come at the beginning of your dependent clause. They're going to signal to you that you have a dependent clause. And we call them subordinating conjunctions. This slide I have is calling them dependent markers, but we call them subordinating conjunctions, so one of the two. But when you see one of these words at the beginning of your clause, then you know you're going to have an independent or a dependent clause. Now remember, those dependent clauses are the ones that cannot stand alone. They can't stand by themselves. So they'll start with things like after, as, because, before, even though, if, since, until, when, whenever. So when you're looking for these, or when you have a clause that starts with a dependent marker or subordinating conjunction, that's going to tell you that that is dependent and it cannot stand on its own. That'll give you a clue that you've got a dependent clause. Okay, now I'm going to give you some examples of dependent clauses. I've got a dependent clause here, because baby Tom cries. When you read that to yourself, you know it does not make sense by itself. It needs something else to add to it. Another way that we can tell that it's a dependent clause is because it starts with a subordinating conjunction. If you look at that, because is one of those markers that we were looking at. So that would give you a clue, since it's coming at the beginning, that that is your dependent clause. Ask yourself if it's a complete thought. Because baby Tom cries. It cannot stand alone, so it has to be a dependent clause. Think of a dependent clause as a cliffhanger. Like you just don't have enough information there. Because baby Tom cries, well, what happens because baby Tom cries? You need more information there. Now, if you attach an independent clause to this, then you would have a complete sentence, and then you'd find out what actually happens. That would give you a complete thought. But this right here does not have a complete thought. It does have a subject and a verb, though. So we've got our subject in this sentence is baby Tom. Okay. Let me use a different color that's not showing up. And then our verb in this sentence is cries. Okay, there's our verb. And then I'm going to karate chop my subject and my predicate. Okay, so let's look at another example. Okay, before we do that, I wanted to add that if we add an independent clause to this, then it would make sense. Because the baby Tom cries, my mom always has the pacifier with her. That is the independent clause I'm attaching to it, and then it makes sense. Now, I have another dependent clause here. When I gave baby Tom a toy, once again, it's a cliffhanger. I don't really know the complete idea here. What happens when I gave baby Tom a toy? So I would look at this and say this is a dependent clause. I also know that by looking at when and knowing that that's a dependent marker or a subordinating conjunction. That when it starts my clause, I know that it's going to be dependent. So once again, I could add something to this to make it complete, but right now it's not complete. So if I added an independent clause to it, and then I could make it a complete sentence. When I gave baby Tom a toy, he smiled. So if I added he smiled, it would make sense. But this clause right here is dependent. It does have a subject and a predicate. My subject in this sentence would be I. Okay. And then my predicate or my verb would be gave. Okay, so I still have my subject and my predicate, but it just cannot stand alone, so it is a dependent clause. Okay, we're going to do a little practice here. We're going to do some practice on independent and dependent clauses, and then we'll be done. So in the first one, up there, it's number 33, it says, what is the dependent clause in the following sentence? Joe played video games until his mom got home from work. You think about that for a second and see if you can figure out what the dependent clause is. So if you picked A, you did that one right, because until his mom got home from work is the one that cannot stand alone. It starts with that subordinating conjunction, so I know that that is the dependent clause. And if I look at number 34, we're looking for the independent clause in this one. See if you can find the independent clause. Which one can stand by itself? Whenever I want to hang out with a friend, I ask my mom to call their parents. Let me try that again. Whenever I want to hang out with a friend, I ask my mom to call their parents. See if you can figure out which one can stand by itself. Okay, so if you picked, I asked my mom to call their parents, you did that right, because that is the one that can stand on its own. The other, whenever I want to hang out with a friend, cannot stand by itself. That's dependent. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, one more practice here. Let's look at 31. What is the dependent clause in the following sentence? Janie reads her book whenever she waits for the bus. Okay, I'll give you a minute to figure out which one you think is the dependent clause. So if you picked whenever she waits for the bus, you did it exactly right. That is the one that cannot stand alone. That is dependent. Okay, now this last one is what is the independent clause in the sentence, in the following sentence? Now remember, independent can stand by itself. Which one of those A, B, or C could stand by itself? And it has a subject and a predicate. Okay, so if you picked B for this one, my best friend is a boy, you did it exactly right. That is the independent clause there. That's the one that has a subject and a predicate and can stand by itself. It's got a complete thought. Okay, hopefully this will help you do your assignment today. And if you have any questions, you can get a hold of your teacher. But you can rewatch the videos many times as you need to. Okay, have a good day, guys.